This is Radio Prague International coming to you from the Czech capital.
Hello and welcome to Radio Prague International with me, Daniela Lazarová. Radio Prague is celebrating its 90th birthday on August 31st, and in the run-up to the anniversary, we look back at the history of Czech Radio's international service and the events that shaped the station over the years. We're now inviting you to hear the third part of our 8-part series, this one focusing on the Prague Spring and the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia.
This is Radio Prague, Czechoslovakia.
Drazí krajany,
transoceánské spojení.
Radio Prague International, 90 years on the air. The second half of the 1960s is often referred to as a period of thaw. Political conditions were becoming more relaxed and there was a certain sense of hope in the air. A spirit of reform also took hold at Czechoslovak radio, including its foreign broadcasting service. Czechoslovakia was opening up to the world and the world was opening up to us. The era of rigid ideology was coming to an end, and so when the famous Laterna Magica Theatre travelled to New York's Carnegie Hall in 1964, Radio Prague invited its director Václav Kašlík to the microphone, and nothing prevented him from praising his cooperation with American colleagues.
Američtí partneři zajišťovali každý detail, téměř každý střih, protože v Americe...
Our American partners took care of every detail, almost every edit. Because in America, as you know, this plays a very important role. There must not be a single dull minute, always forward, and towards the climax.
V New Yorku absolvoval, zvlášť když zpíváme česky.
Censorship still prevailed throughout all Czechoslovak media, and Radio Prague was no exception. Despite the undeniable relaxation, both the vocabulary and the tone changed only slowly. This is how Anton Korman recalled the communist takeover as late as in 1966. The broadcast was intended for compatriots in America.
Many of you didn't like it, because by doing so we spoiled their own plans. It was not long before the wartime coalition forged in the struggle against Hitler and his executioners. Bio unforgettable Roosevelt, together with Churchill and Stalin, fell apart. A few months passed and innocent blood was already flowing around the 39th parallel in Korea. Such was the situation at the time. We wanted to show you then, our dear compatriots, through our daily broadcasts, how we thought and what we were doing. At that time, we received very few newspapers from you, and those that did arrive came very irregularly. You, in turn, did not have our newspapers. We did not know each other well. That is why we looked forward so much to every letter from you and every word you sent us. It was proved to us that across thousands of kilometers, and despite all the Dulleses and McCarthys, your interest in the old homeland had not diminished.
And then it happened.
Dostal jsem dotaz týkající se cenzury. Zrušení cenzury, jedná se o nějakých opatřeních pro zrušení cenzury, ptá se tazatel. Cenzura přestala, přátelé, existovat. Hurá!
In March 1968, the Central Committee of the Communist Party approved the end of censorship. The Prague Spring had begun. Radio Prague, which until then had served exclusively to spread the ideas of socialism, also began broadcasting freely. Recalling those days is Pavla Jazajriová, who in 1968 worked in the French-language broadcasts intended for Africa.
The
Prague Spring, that was an event. Suddenly, all sorts of newspapers and magazines were being published. We went to see Italian films and so on. It was a beautiful time. Especially for a young person, it was a wonderful time. Naturally, we talked about everything. We talked about Dubček, we talked about socialism with a human face, and we were happy.
When the broadcasts started sounding a little different from before, did listeners react to it in any way? Did they notice the change?
No jistě, že reagovali na to. A pokud si můžu pamatovat, tak ne vždycky na to.
Of course they reacted to it. And if I remember correctly, they did not always react positively. And besides, how can you expect people who live in such distant places, somewhere in a village, to understand what political changes in Europe actually mean?
Aby pochopili, co to jsou politické změny v Evropě.
Pavla Jazajriová's memories are also confirmed by the letters that arrived at the Foreign Broadcasting Service. Listeners in Europe and compatriots in the United States mostly welcomed the new course of Czechoslovak politics and the way in which it was reported by the foreign broadcasts. Listeners in Latin America and especially in Africa viewed the change with uncertainty, says Tomáš Dufka, head of the Czech Radio Archive.
V těch zemích, kde došlo například k dekolonizaci a československé zahraniční.
The most puzzled reactions came from countries in Africa and Latin America, where decolonization had taken place and where Czechoslovak foreign broadcasting had considerable room to operate and exert influence through its propaganda. Suddenly the broadcast sounded different. There was even uncertainty about whether the country was moving in the right direction. The reactions of listeners there were probably different from those in the rest of the world.
Jiné než z ostatního zbytku světa.
While listeners in the Third World did not understand the changes, the communist leaders of neighbouring countries understood them all too well and viewed them with displeasure. In the German Democratic Republic, the eastern part of what was then a divided Germany, the local communist leader Walter Ulbricht even ordered jamming devices to be used against the foreign broadcasts of Czechoslovak radio. This was already at the beginning of May 1968. Among the so-called fraternal states, it was something entirely unprecedented. Bedřich Utic, then head of the German-language broadcasts, recalled those events for Memory of Nations.
Když byl Ulbricht na oficiální návštěvě v Praze, tak na tiskově...
When Ulbricht was on an official visit to Prague, the abolition of censorship in our country was discussed at a press conference, to which he replied, "We do not have to abolish anything in our country because no censorship exists there." Of course, I broadcast that 3 or 4 times and said, at the request of listeners whose reception is being jammed, we are repeating Comrade Ulbricht's statement. Naturally, these were things that irritated them enormously. When our Foreign Minister Hayek paid an official visit to the GDR, I interviewed him after his return. When it was over, he said, "I spent most of my time listening to complaints about your broadcasts."
Strávil posloucháním stížností na tvoje vysílání.
Listener responses had always arrived at the Foreign Broadcasting Service in large numbers, but during the Prague Spring, the station's audience grew even further. People around the world closely followed developments in Czechoslovakia, and that interest was reflected in a flood of letters. During 1968, the largest number came from German-speaking countries and from France. One letter sent to the Foreign Broadcasting Service came from a listener named Paul Murray Lantoine, says Tomáš Dufka, head of the Czech Radio Archive.
Přeji vám, aby se Dubčekovy cíle uskutečnily. Jemu většina Čechů nakloněna.
I wish for Dubček's goals to be achieved. Does the majority of Czechs support him? Will the Czechs be able to resist Moscow? Is their freedom not restricted by the Russians? What are the Russians' interests? Could I obtain the 2,000 words manifesto?
Svoboda omezena Rusy. Jaké jsou zájmy Rusů? Mohl bych dostat manifest 2000 slov?
And we even have the reply to that letter.
Od vašeho posledního dopisu vývoj situace dal odpověď na některé z vašich otázek.
Since your last letter, developments have provided answers to some of your questions. The talks in Černá and Bratislava ended in an atmosphere of understanding and friendship. We regret that we don't have a French translation of the 2,000 words manifesto available. I cannot see the date on the reply, but it must be from the beginning of August, while the original letter is probably from sometime in July.
Ta odpověď a ten dopis asi někdy z července.
Včera, dne 20. srpna 1968, kolem 23. hodiny, překročila vojska Sovětského svazu, Polské lidové republiky, Německé demokratické republiky, Maďarské lidové republiky a Bulharské lidové republiky.
Yesterday, on the 20th of August 1968, at around 11 p.m., troops of the Soviet Union, the Polish People's Republic, the German Democratic Republic, the Hungarian People's Republic, and the People's Republic of Bulgaria crossed the state borders of the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. This happened without the knowledge of the President of the Republic.
The Prague Spring was brought to an abrupt end by the entry of Warsaw Pact troops into Czechoslovakia on the night of August 21st, 1968. The country was invaded by the armies of 5 communist states, and Radio Prague naturally reported on it. At least during the first hours after the occupation, it continued broadcasting in foreign languages and became an important source of information about events in Czechoslovakia, not only for listeners, but also for the foreign media.
This is Radio Prague, Czechoslovakia, broadcasting continuously in English, French, German, and Italian, as well as Czech.
The broadcasts were mainly live and were not recorded. Parts of them, however, were preserved either by foreign radio stations in their archives or by listeners themselves.
We are transmitting in the 49-meter band on 6.055.
Recalling the events of August 1968 is Richard Seemann, then Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Radio Prague. Later, he worked as a stoker, then as Acting Director General of Czechoslovak Federal Radio, and afterwards as Director of Foreign Broadcasting.
I was responsible for news coverage in the foreign broadcasts. Since we are sitting here now, I can say that the very first report was prepared right next to me by the young editor Karel Vix. We broadcast that report abroad immediately.
Karel Vix, then an editor with a foreign broadcasting service, remembered it this way.
I arrived only at 5 in the morning and I stayed there until the end, until they threw us out. We thought they would not throw us out, so we went and bought various things of food and alcohol so that we could last there for a long time. Then they confiscated everything and threw us out. There were several interesting scenes. One of them was when Karel Hrabal, then director of foreign broadcasting, invited us young editors into his office. He told us not to be afraid, that they were all blank cartridges, that surely they would not shoot at us with live ammunition. And then a burst from a submachine gun rang out. It hit the ceiling in his office, which was a large corner room. The bullets were right there in the room, dust flying everywhere. We all dropped to the floor and crawled out.
Jana Hořínková had joined the Foreign Broadcasting Service only shortly before as a technician. This is how she remembered August the 21st of 1968.
Já jsem přišla až v 12:30 odpoledne, dřív jsem se nedostala. I arrived only at 1:30 in the afternoon. I couldn't get here any earlier. The bus was already standing in front of the radio building, and at the age of 18, I saw a dead person lying in the radio hall for the first time in my life. I was supposed to have been at work earlier, so I went to apologize. My boss told me, from now on, only Russian. It took me by surprise, and to this day I don't know whether he meant it as a joke or seriously. I just stood there staring at him. I stayed here until 7 in the evening. Then they told us whoever wants to stay overnight can remain here. Otherwise we are closing the building and everyone else should go home.
Kdo tady chce přenocovat, tak tady bude, jinak zavíráme budovu a ostatní domů.
Radio Praha, Československo. Vysílání svobodného československého rozhlasu. Posloucháte nás na krátkých vlnách spásů.
The Czechoslovak radio building had been occupied, so an alternative solution had to be found. Italian communists extended a helping hand to the foreign broadcasting service. For years, in cooperation with Radio Prague, they had operated their own broadcast to Italy. Because they lived and broadcast in Prague secretly, their editorial offices and studios were not located in the main Czechoslovak radio building on Vinohradská Street, but in a villa in Prague's Nusle district. Foreign broadcasting continued from there, describes researcher Ulriko Bovo.
Když proběhla okupace jako Československa a okupace tady jako...
When the occupation of Czechoslovakia took place, and the occupation of the building where we are now, the Italian journalists called their Czech colleagues who already had a sense that something was happening. We're talking about 18 years after that radio station was founded. They suspected that something was going on. They told them to come and broadcast from there, simply handed over the keys to the editorial offices and said, boys, here are your microphones.
From the villa in Nusle, editors of the Foreign Broadcasting Service transmitted 10-minute programs in English, Italian, French, German and Spanish. They were broadcast to the entire world. Richard Seemann continues.
And later, in 1969, when it was still possible to travel abroad, I was a guest of West German radio, and they told me that they had listened to it and found it interesting. They learned what was happening here.
As Ulriko Bovo explains, the station managed to stay hidden.
Rusové nikdy nenašli tu budovu. Dokonce je...
The Russians never found that building. One amusing story. A Russian tank stopped in front of the house where one of the Italians lived. They thought, that's it, they've got us now. Then a Russian soldier got out and simply relieved himself against the corner of the building. So they said to themselves, boys, everything's fine. The Russians never found the station, but later the Communist Party, not Dubček's Communist Party, but the one that came after the invasion, shut it down.
Tak samozřejmě to radio zavřel.
Years later, Karel Vys recalled the same incident.
I remember it was na Květnici Street, Nusle. A tank arrived and drove down the street. I don't know why, it's a villa district. We were all frightened because there was an escape plan that we would get away through the gardens. So we were squeezing through a hole in a fence to escape, and in front of me was Nev, who couldn't get through the wire opening in the fence. So I gave up, and meanwhile the tank drove on.
History repeated itself. Just as 30 years earlier, in 1938, Radio Prague had refuted the slanders spread by German Nazis, the Foreign Broadcasting Service now responded to disinformation spread by the Soviet occupation forces. On September 9th, after 2 weeks, Soviet soldiers left the Czechoslovak radio building. The editors were able to return to their offices and the stations could begin broadcasting again, including Radio Prague, as Richard Seemann and Karel Vix recall.
We then returned to the radio building after the Russians vacated it. First, everything had to be disinfected because it was in a desperate state. They had looted everything they could and conditions were appalling, especially in terms of hygiene. Broadcasting resumed normally. It must be said that the technology was not as complicated then as it is now. The food and drink disappeared, but then I heard a story from my colleague, the French language broadcaster Joseph Sincibus, who kept a permanent display in his office of Stalin's, Lenin's and Marx's, photographs and slogans. Thinking it was a red corner, they never entered the room.
The editorial offices came back to life, but nothing was the same as before August 21st. Conditions in society and in the media began to tighten once again. The period of normalization had begun. In other words, the return of censorship and renewed submission to communist power.
Městská správa veřejné bezpečnosti v Praze sděluje, že dnes kolem 15. hodiny se na Václavském náměstí těžce popálil 21letý...
Today at around 3 p.m. on Wenceslas Square, a man set himself on fire.
Přivodil si těžké popáleniny. Rychlým zákrokem dispečera dopravního podniku byl oheň na studentu.
In an effort to rouse society to resist the military occupation of Czechoslovakia, student Jan Palach set himself on fire on Wenceslas Square in Prague on January 16th of 1969.
Praha, 24. ledna 1969. V Karolínu se poklonil národ Janu Palachovi.
Palach's funeral became one of the last demonstrations against the growing apathy in society. This is how Pavla Jazajriová recalled that day.
No, já si ještě pamatuju, že jsem vlastně reportovala, jestli se nemýlím, ten pohřeb Palacha.
I still remember reporting on Jan Palach's funeral. That had stayed with me. The time when Palach set himself on fire. For me, as for other young people, it was just terrible. We experienced it very deeply. The radio fell silent. Only morning music was played throughout the day. Nothing at all was broadcast the entire day, not even the foreign broadcasts.
Se nevysílalo vůbec nic, jo? V zahraniční vysílání.
The Prague Spring was definitively over. Purges also began at Radio Prague. Anyone who had become involved during the period of political change had to go. Anyone who disagreed with the presence of Soviet troops had to leave. When the new leadership of the Communist Party, the state, and Czechoslovak radio itself settled accounts with the Prague Spring period, the Foreign Broadcasting Service was labelled one of the main nests of counter-revolution. Paradoxically, this was helped along by an analysis of the letters that had arrived at Radio Prague during the political thaw. Czech radio archivist Tomáš Dufka continues.
Ta analýza je neskutečně podrobná a je to taky důvod, proč nám asi ty dopisy zbyly.
The analysis is incredibly detailed. That's also the reason why those letters survived. They sorted them, numbered them, translated quotations from the letters. The assignment was clear: carry out a purge in the Foreign Broadcasting Service. On the basis of those listeners' letters, they also created a picture of which people in foreign broadcasting should be dismissed. Not a stone was left standing. Even foreigners had to leave after 1968 and return to their own countries.
Museli odejít zpět do svých zemí.
Pavla Jazayriová, who worked in Radio Prague's French language broadcasts for Africa, recalls.
Potom už přišly dotazníky v tom slova smyslu, že musíme souhlasit.
Then the questionnaires started coming. We were expected to agree with the entry of the fraternal armies. I did not sign. They wanted us to join some organization, either the Socialist Youth Union or the Women's Union. I was young and rebellious. It seemed so incredibly shameful to me that I did not join, and I must say I was honestly glad that they dismissed me. It was not in me to leave on my own. I would not have been able to do it. I loved the job too much. By not allowing me to become mentally twisted there, I am grateful to the comrades to this day for firing me.
Tak já jsem jim za to do dneška vděčná těm soudruhům, že vlastně mě tenkrát vyhodili.
Karel Vichs recalls his departure in the following manner.
Já jsem byl vyveden z rozhlasu, doslova vyveden.
I left, if I'm not mistaken, only in 1970. Almost everyone had left before me. There was a tendency that all of us would be replaced by a new generation. Whatever they could not manage, they would simply fill with music.
Tak se dá prostě hudba.
Former foreign broadcasting technician Jana Hořínková recalled the atmosphere of the weeks and months that followed.
Přišli hodně nových lidí, já nevím, tak 15 určitě na začátku, hned v tom 69.
A lot of new people arrived, about 15 right at the beginning in 1969. We called them the youth, Lenin's new youth. They had just finished secondary schools and immediately joined in.
Nastoupili jako kádři.
And did they already know the languages at that time?
Někdo přišel, některý uměl, to byli třeba ze smíšeného manželství, někdo neuměl tvrdě.
Some came and did know them, often because they came from mixed marriages. Others didn't know them and firmly declared that they would learn them in 6 weeks. They were believed. They got into the editorial office and usually became the boss. The boss didn't need to know languages very well because he never went on the air. He only approved what was going to be broadcast. That was determined by the editor-in-chief, and there was never a problem with that. The main thing was that they knew they would do things their own way.
A hlavně věděli, že oni si pojedou svojí.
Almost all experienced editors, many of whom had worked at Radio Prague for years, had to leave. The Italian broadcasts also came to an end, not only because their editors had stood by their radio colleagues, but also because the entire Italian Communist Party condemned the invasion. This is how commentator Karel Šimon explained to compatriots what had taken place in society and in the media during the so-called Prague Spring.
Nejobtížnější prověrkou zásadovosti pro každého občana naší země a zejména pro funkcionáře.
The most difficult test of principle for every citizen of our country, and especially for officials, was the crisis period of 1968-69. The overwhelming majority stood firm, but there were many who faltered. A very important feature of socialist morality, as Vladimir Ilyich Lenin repeatedly demonstrated, is honesty. Honesty towards the working classes, the party, and the people, the nation. We stress this because during the period of the so-called renewal process, all the basic values and principles of communist morality were trampled upon by its initiators.
Základní hodnoty a principy komunistické morálky pošlapány.
It was the year 1979, and strict censorship had once again prevailed in foreign broadcasting. The station had once more become a loyal servant of the Communist Party and its government. Radio Prague would have to wait another 20 years for the next spring to arrive. That was the third part of our 8-part series on the history of Radio Prague International. Next time, we'll look at the station as a tool of communist propaganda. This is Daniela Lazarová saying thanks for joining us and take care.